I tried not to take offense that everyone kind of came in and sat at that end, but I appreciate the opportunity to be here. What she didn't say in both introductions, which is perhaps the most salient point about me, is that my wife and I have 8 children, of whom are married. We have 19 grandchildren. So logistical issues is something we deal with a lot, and education obviously is something that's important to us. To begin with, I just want to say, and there's a lot that we're going to try to cover today, much of it, again, you can go back and review. It's probably not all that critical that you'll remember all of the details, but the details may help you kind of form some conceptual ideas in your role as governing members of your institutions and or systems. But first, I just want to say thank you. You know, I've been a staff member at a system here at Texas for 15 years. And you need to know your role as a governing board member has a significant impact. I have so appreciated and admired the service that has been given by our many regents over those years on behalf of the University of Texas, its institutions, and primarily its students and faculty. It is a thankless job. If you haven't discovered that yet, you will. For which you're paid just, you know, tremendous amounts of money. But it really defines, in my book, what public service is all about. And again, we have relied upon, I personally have appreciated and relied upon the counsel we have gotten and direction from our board members. I have just been wowed at the amount of time that they have dedicated to help us and to help our institutions move forward. So thank you. Quickly, we're going to kind of try to cover these sort of 4 areas, and then I'll interject a couple of additional thoughts that I think are somewhat important. But we're going to kind of drill down. We're going to start kind of from the state level in budgeting, sort of the overall budget, then kind of higher education, and then down to institutional funding beyond the state funding that we receive. And as was mentioned in there, really less than 30% of the funding for our institutions, our academic institutions, comes from the state, and at larger research institutions, it's even smaller. It's down in the teens in terms of the percent of support coming from state appropriation. And then I just want to talk a little bit about sort of a new initiative introduced by our board that I think has some merit, at least for us, and that's the long-range strategic financial planning. So state of Texas, state funding sources, and again, I'm not going to go through these, state tax collections, federal funds, which are not insignificant, many of which, perhaps the majority coming related to healthcare operations, Medicaid, Medicare funding from the federal government, fees, fines, interest, lottery, state land income, other, et cetera. And I'm going to try to move quickly. Please stop me if there are questions, but I hope we'll have a little bit of time at the end for questions as well. The method of finance, which you'll hear as a sort of term of art in the state budget circles, really talks about kind of which categories these funds fall into, or these revenues fall into. General revenue is noted here. There's dedicated, and as it implies, these are funds dedicated for a particular purpose. This tuition revenue is the statutory part of tuition. It's really, at one point, prior to tuition deregulation, prior to my time here, about 2 decades ago, it made up a significant piece. The statutory piece now has remained fixed for years, and the majority of the tuition revenue, as you'll see in a minute, comes from really designated tuition set by the boards. But there is a statutory piece of the state funding that comes and is dedicated toward tuition, toward use by colleges and universities. Fees, state parks, again, associated with their particular functions. Federal funds we talked about, grants from federal government, employee benefits, we also get money related to that. And then the highway funds, other funds, bond proceeds, et cetera, that we can cover in a minute if you have questions. So this is the $250 billion biennial budget. And again, this is not an annual budget, but a biennial one. And as I'm sure you all know, but somewhat unique, at least nationally for higher education, our fiscal year is September 1 through August 31st. Most other institutions of higher education run from, at least in my experience, from kind of July 1st to June 30th. Here, again, September 1 to August 31st, really in line with kind of the legislature and how it works. But they pass a 2 years, so this is roughly $125 billion in each of those years of the biennium, and divided, as noted, the $119 billion is in general revenue. Then you can see the dedicated, the federal funds, again, not an insignificant piece, and then the other funds. This is the same breakdown of the $250 billion biennial 2-year budget by the various, again, functions. And you can see higher education, not an insignificant piece, $22 billion, but 9% of the total budget. And so the state legislature, the governor, all of the delegates, all of the representatives, all of the senators have a difficult task. And while we always are in need of additional funds, and are grateful for what we receive, we are mindful that they have also large problems in health and human services, in public education, and even in some of these others, public safety and criminal justice. And so there are never enough resources to go around, and it is a difficult and challenging task as they move forward. So higher education, again, by the state, but not their only issue that they need to deal with. It takes out, if you go back a couple, this $119 billion of general revenue is then divided out by function. So again, as you can see, we're about 13% if you just look at the general revenue piece, which is the more flexible part of the revenue, and you can see the breakdown there again. The largest piece being in K through 12 public education for this, and then health and human resources. So they get a little higher share. This is again because of the federal funds coming in that makes that a little higher in the total budget, but in the general revenue, public education is the dominating source for funds. All right, so how does it get from general revenue into the institutions? Well, we have a formula funding process, and again, this is fairly consistent with other states. Our formulas are a little bit different, but we'll go through this in more detail than you probably want, but there are some important elements to it. Formula funding, formulas are used, again, to distribute the money, and we'll talk about that because, well, I'll get to that a little bit, but there's an important distinction there. The formula really is about a distribution mechanism rather than sort of fully funding the need, and we'll talk about that a little bit. And then there are non-formula funding pieces, which are, again, are a not insignificant part of the funds that we receive. They used to be called special items, or now they're called, again, just non-formula support items, and some are direct allocations to campuses that have been sort of historic. There are special strategic or higher education needs that the legislature had designated, and so they have made these special allocations. The available university fund and the higher education fund, these are dollars to support capital. The available university fund comes from the permanent university fund. The PUF, as I suspect many of you know, the state set aside about 2.1 million acres, largely in West Texas, over a century ago. And from that, oil and gas revenues oil and gas has been sold. Those revenues have been put into an endowment, the Permanent University Fund. That endowment has grown significantly, and then the distribution goes into this available university fund. So about 5% of that PUF, like any endowment, gets distributed each year into the available university fund, which is used to benefit the institutions at the University of Texas and the Texas A&M systems. It still, though, is appropriated by the legislature. If you're not one of the institutions from Texas or Texas A&M systems, you may think, well, gosh, I feel disadvantaged, and I wish I could have an opportunity to participate in the Permanent University Fund. And that may or may not be true because the legislature, in response, set up a higher education fund. Basically, their own endowment, not generated from oil and gas revenues, but money set aside to, again, fund capital for the other systems and institutions in the state. And in fact, if you go historically back, it sort of goes back and forth from time to time.
Just a Q&A mic.
Oh, okay, great. Goes back and forth, but the higher education fund the last decade or two, really has supported the other institutions almost at the same level as the available university fund, at least in terms of capital needs being presented. So those are two, and then there's group insurance, as noted as well, in the non-formula funding. All right, so again, the formula is generated to support basically the primary operations of our institutions. Now, one point I'm just going to make here that I think is important. One of the criticisms that higher education faces often is that its costs continue to outpace inflation. And so why is that? It is perhaps an inefficient enterprise. Well, I would argue and contend that there are a number of reasons associated with the cost pressures in higher education. One of which probably is something that we're still trying to work through, and that is that if you look at how you measure quality in higher education, it tends to be more on input side. Numbers of volumes in the library, a lower student-faculty ratio, meaning more faculty per students taught. Those kinds of input factors to reflect quality then push up costs. Now, I think higher education has made great strides in countering that. We still teach fundamentally in some of the same ways, but we thought distance education, online learning would transform, and to some extent it has, but it's been more additive than it has in sort of replacing some of the core instruction. But that's one piece. Second, and these are issues that really are outside of what would be typically found in other industries. One is there have been changes in higher education. Think about what it takes now to educate a student in engineering versus what it took a generation ago. It is an entirely new environment. The equipment that's needed, the education that's needed. These, to keep pace with the ongoing rise in technology and being able to provide state-of-the-art education has pushed costs up in higher education. In addition, there are new regulatory demands. I'll tell you, when I went to school, we didn't have a Department of Environmental Health and Safety. We didn't have a Department of Risk Management. We may have had one officer that had responsibility for that. That's changed, and probably for the good. But there are no public safety. Police departments have gotten larger. All of these things outside of the core academic mission, but still necessary in creating a safe community and something that our students need. And then lastly, look at what students have demanded in the last couple of decades. Again, when I went to school, there may have been a placement office, but it's not like it is today. There certainly weren't rec centers. There weren't the kinds of extracurricular activities and opportunities for students, career advising, service placement, et cetera, that are now demanded, needed, and part of a sort of robust education. And so while there is, I think, great desire to hold down costs, there are inherent in higher education these pressures to increase costs that have made it difficult, aside from whether or not a particular institution is efficient. The second piece that I would just mention on this that's also hard for higher education is if you think about productivity, it's not about the amount of money or the reduction of money being input. It is what is the outcome based on the investments made. Sometimes you may be spending more in a particular entity and generating higher efficiencies because you're creating better outcomes. And in some cases, you may be spending less and be less efficient because the outcomes are not increasing and are dropping off. And in higher education, it's in industry, it's great. You can talk about, I'm going to invest so much and I'm going to see that return on this investment. In higher education, when you look at the many outcomes, is it graduation rates? Certainly. But is it research? Certainly. Is it service to the community? Certainly. If I put $1 in here, how does it flow through and what is the particular outcome? And so trying to understand and tie outcomes to particular investments continues to be a challenge in higher education. It makes it difficult at times to measure and really project some of the efficiencies that are taking place. So those are my editorial comments. Move on. Functions not included in the formula funding, we talked about this a little bit, and there have been a couple of new initiatives, particularly by the legislature, related to research. For example, the TRIP, Texas Research Incentive Program, was a matching program for research dollars that were coming in. There have been others to attract, again, key faculty members that would bring both expertise, research dollars, and again would have opportunities to interact with students and overall increase the educational experience for our students. So a number of those, and then we also have AUF, which I mentioned before, and some other auxiliary and institutional funding. Components for the formula. Okay, so let's talk then about the formula funding. And there are sort of two major and one smaller. There's I&O, Instruction and Operations, infrastructure support, which also includes a little supplement for small institutions, and then teaching experience, which I'll go through again quickly, but in some detail. The instruction and operation, again, driven by expense per credit hour. And so we'll walk through that. But every credit hour taken by a student is weighted based on, again, the thought of the associated expenses of teaching a student in that particular discipline. So again, a credit hour in freshman history is probably going to be less expensive than a credit hour for a master's degree in engineering. And the formula, this weight, is designed to try to reflect those differences. The infrastructure is, again, in addition to the credit hours taught, includes the program mix, and you can read this stuff, research expenditures, et cetera. And then the teaching experience, which is relatively simple to understand, basically is designed to try to give a supplement for those institutions putting more tenured faculty in the classes rather than adjunct in order to, again, increase or enhance the educational experience for the students. All right, so for the formula, the instruction I&O, which is the bulk of it, there are two elements of this, the base period and the weighted semester credit hours, which we talked about. The base period basically is you look at 12 months and you just sort of set that in place. And it really talks about, as noted here, the summer and fall of the even-numbered years, and then the spring of the odd number. And the legislature meets in the spring, in January of the odd number years. So when they get the data, they're basically looking at the most recent year, but then it's fixed. That's the base year. So they're going to look at all of the credit hours for that, basically, if you're in the legislature, that spring, and then the past fall and summer. And so if your enrollment changes in the next couple of years, or particularly in that next year that's not in the base year, it's not reflected in the formula. So they lock it in and they say, okay, this is how many credit hours were taught in that particular base year. So that's the sort of the unadjusted credit hours, the unweighted credit hours. Then they'll look at weights. And again, as we talked about conceptually, it's designed to try to add weights to those programs that are more expensive to reflect that. And so I'm not going to go through this, but quickly, and I've got some other charts here, a 3-hour lower division course with 20 students would generate 60 weighted credit hours. Again, 60 semester credit hours. So it's just look at again, how many students, how many credit hours, and so 30 times, or 20 times 3 is the 60. Then you apply a weight, and for lower division history, it's just flat. It's just a single 1.0. But the master's course in business has a different weight, 3.27. The weights are determined in large part by the coordinating board in some expense analysis, and so they adjust over time, although there has been discussion by the new commissioner to review or revisit that and think about how we might be a little bit more progressive and match those weights in a more equitable way. There's also been discussion about performance outcomes and some other things in terms of incentive funding, but for right now, it's using this formula. So you have a weight 3.27, doctoral even higher, 8.12, and then you basically apply the 20 students times the 3 hours, which is 60, times that weight of 8.112, and so you get 487. So again, you're weighting, you're looking at first the unadjusted student semester credit hours over that base year, and then you're weighting them up and you're getting into the total of the weighted semester credit hours. And again, this chart just shows some of the differentials. You'll have it in your packet you can look at. But you can see, not surprisingly, the difference between as you move from lower division, upper division, master's and doctoral, and then you can see things like engineering are going to be weighted higher than liberal arts, etc. This then, getting from semester credit hours to instruction and operations income. Now here's the little twist that I just want to make sure we all understand. Once the legislature has determined, through the coordinating board's help and through the legislative budget board, they look at the base year, they look at the semester credit hours, they apply the weights, so what programs, what classes were these students in, and they get a total number of weighted semester credit hours, weighted credit hours. I don't know what the total is, $1.5 million. They then look at how much money they have to spend to appropriate to higher education. That's sort of outside of this. This formula just takes that money and distributes it according to those weights. Now the reason that that's somewhat important is, as an institution, if your enrollment is not growing at the same rate as other institutions, and if it's not growing at the same rate as the increase is in the overall funding pool, then you are going to get less money. So while, and in fact, the legislature may be putting more money into the formula, but this actual weighted credit hour, 5585, which was calculated, could actually go down because the number of weighted credit hours went up more than the increase that they provided. And so if you are generating fewer semester credit hours or the same semester credit hours, weighted semester credit hours on your campus, and think that, gosh, I should get the same or a little bit more, you actually could get less. So it is a distribution mechanism more than it is sort of a full funding mechanism, which creates some challenges as institutions sort of compete amongst themselves. Any questions about that? I just think that's an important point to just kind of note. Yes?
In this waiting process, or is it just, are they involved in the waiting process, or is it just the coordinating board that makes that decision?
So great question. There is a formula advisory committee that is set up by the coordinating board, and they reach out to get representatives from institutions to help with that. But it has been more about how do we adjust the formula. It still requires some legislative action, and over time it's gone sort of back and forth. And again, my understanding with Commissioner Keller, that I think this is an issue that he wants to address and begin to work through. But it's, this is not necessarily an inequitable way to do it. It just creates some challenges as we work through that.
Well, can you, for instance, if we're on the board of a particular university and we don't like the way it's weighted, can we weigh in? Can we speak to that point, or can that be, I won't say challenged, but questioned and then reconsidered in some way? For instance, if we've got an institution where the enrollment is growing at a really rapid pace, and we feel that the weighting formula is not taking that in consideration, can that be questioned, or is that just a given?
So my response would be, and I'm happy there's some other seasoned people here that could, but there's sort of two things. One, long-term, discussion and input about long-term changes to the formula, I think, are always welcome and will flow in, but will take time for corrections. For immediate issues, if there are challenges, they're usually dealt with, again, with outside of sort of the formula process. And if there are real needs, the legislature has stepped in on occasion and said, we need to create either a one-time supplement to this campus, et cetera, or to sort of help. But again, going back to the first chart, in terms of what the legislature is trying to deal with, that's sometimes difficult. But they won't be able to adjust or change the formula sort of in the midst of the session, so that's more of a long-term approach. I'm sorry, Regent Giles.
No, you were right.
Okay.
You were right, Scott.
If you could hold on, because we want to capture
on film.
the question for the video.
To answer your question, yes, the coordinating board has an advisory committee specifically for formula funding advisory, and all the chancellors and university presidents have opportunity to nominate folks to be on that committee. So it's an extensive process, and Mr. Kelly is correct once things get set, but opportunities for universities and chancellors and trustees through this committee have an opportunity to voice their concerns early.
Thank you. All right. So this is just now applying the 3-hour, again, this is the $3,000, so you actually apply what you would get for that, and you can see a 3-hour class, how much you would receive based on the particular weights. The infrastructure support is the second piece of the formula. Again, not as significant, not as large as the I&O, but again, and it is driven by predicted square feet. Again, not necessarily the square feet that exists on the campus, but the predicted square feet based on the formula. And again, there is an advisory committee to work with this, and in fact, I've seen adjustments made on this one over my tenure here, probably more than I have in sort of the I&O formula. But the idea is to try to provide support for utilities, for ongoing maintenance based on the infrastructure needs for a campus. The coordinating board projection model sort of encompasses these criteria. The teaching space is noted, and that's, again, programmatic areas and the level of student credit hours, so there's an interplay with that. But then they also, from that, add faculty, students, programs to try to determine library, research space, they'll look at research expenditures, office space, again, faculty, et cetera, and then support space, which is sort of plugged in at 9% of the total predicted. So they actually add that just as sort of an upgrade. And again, this is then used, you look at the space projection, take the dollars that are allocated into the infrastructure formula and distribute it accordingly. The addition, as I mentioned, the last piece, this is the teaching experience, and it really is just an add-on based on, and it's an extra 10% weight for those classes, again, with tenure track faculty to teach undergraduate students. Again, with the idea that giving these students access to really more, to significant faculty will enhance their teaching experience. All right, formula funding distribution across higher education institutions. This is sort of what we talked about. Grows and weighted semester credit, why the formulas are used as a mechanism to distribute rather than necessarily fully fund. So when they come up with that total of $55, that doesn't suggest that that funds all of the needs. In fact, that is just the amount that's been imputed based on the dollars that they have to allocate divided by the number of weighted semester credit hours. And then again, universities, as we mentioned, growing at slower than average will end up with smaller pieces of the funding pie. So send them all to the University of Texas system. This then, okay, so from the academic institutions, again, $5.4 billion by function, and you can just see we get the largest piece from instruction operations formula, 7%, and then again, some of these direct allocations to campuses and other, and then there's some research funds. So I just want to talk about TRBs, and you may be aware of this. This is a wonderful program, but it is somewhat different in terms of how Texas funds capital projects in its state. In many states, the voters will issue approval to issue a general obligation bond, so the bond is the debt of the state. They then will pay it back through their appropriations over the tenure of the bond, and the capital raised by that bond will be distributed for buildings on the campuses. Here, they've got this mechanism called tuition revenue bonds. It's really a bit of a misnomer. It's not associated really with tuition. What they do is the legislature approves the issuance capital projects for the campuses. So let's say $500 million of capital projects as distributed. The campuses take their piece. So if the University of Texas system has $100 million that has been approved by the legislature, we will go out and issue $100 million of debt ourselves. So it is our debt. It's not owned by the state. It is owned by us. The commitment from the legislature is to reimburse us through the appropriation an amount equal to the debt service, the principal and interest that we're going to pay back over the 20-year life or maybe 30-year life of that particular bond. Usually it's 20 is what they set it at. So the debt is on the books of your systems or your campuses. But the money to reimburse the debt service, the actual payments, the mortgage payment, if you will, against that debt, comes from the state in its biennial appropriations. Now, and it's worked fine, and we are most appreciative of that, but there are some glitches in that, one of which is, in reality, one legislature cannot bind another. So when you go to the rating agencies, there's sometimes a little bit of concern, okay, you know, one of the sources of income, we want to talk to you about this because we're going to issue $100 million of debt, but we're going to get the $5 million that we need each year to pay it from the state. Well, that's committed absolutely for the next 2 years, but the next legislature then needs to renew it. Now, we have a great history there that you can point to, and the legislature understands that if they were ever to default on that sort of implicit pledge, that it would send sort of ripples through the debt community and make it more difficult for us to issue bonds in this regard. And so they've held to that commitment. Even when there have been cuts in other areas, they've typically stayed and continued to fund the debt service related to the tuition revenue bonds. But again, we have tuition revenue bonds that go to MD Anderson, which really don't have any students, and so tuition is really not an operative term in that. And when they issue tuition revenue bonds is really up to the legislature, or when they approve those projects for us to issue the bonds. They, again, did the session before last. There was discussion in this last session. It didn't make it through. We're always hopeful and probably will work through a process to help the legislature understand our capital needs and see if we can get some additional capital support for that. So any questions about TRBs? All right. Institutional funding and budgeting activities, and I'll go quickly now. So general academic, educational funding, again, we talked about formula, non-formula. We also have this, again, these are all appropriated, which is important because that carries with it certain restrictions. But there's so the dedicated, we've talked about that, statutory tuition, other income, the available university funds still appropriated. This tobacco endowment proceeds, that was an endowment set aside years ago with a tobacco settlement, generates some income. Again, all appropriated through the legislature. We have non-appropriated funds, and this is money really generated by the institutions. And here, the designated tuition, which is set by the regents or the trustees, by the boards. And this is money then collected by the institutions. It's added to the statutory tuition, which again is a smaller piece of that total pool. Then there's incidental fees, indirect costs. Auxiliary enterprises, when you hear that term, that means it's auxiliary to the primary mission. So parking, they're helpful, they're part of the community, but parking garages, rec centers, housing are all, they generate revenue, and often they'll use that to issue debt and build buildings and such, but those are auxiliary to the primary mission of teaching, research, service, and healthcare. Restricted funds, largely in research, sometimes they can be grants or gifts as well, and they're great, but as you know, they're restricted in purpose. And so, often the legislature may want to say, hey, you've received this additional amount of funding. We can withdraw or pull back a little bit of your appropriation. Well, it's not necessarily going for the same things. And often, particularly with donors, and both research, it's directed toward research. With donors, they have a particular interest. And so if you pull back the general revenue or tuition, then you have less dollars to do some of the primary operations because you still have to set these dollars aside for their particular restricted activities. And I know you all get that. So sources of uses, again, say state appropriated, 28%. We talked about that under 30. And again, for Austin, I think it's probably about 15%, to give you a sense. I don't know what it is, A&M, but the larger the institution, probably the smaller piece of the pie will be state appropriated. Tuition and fees, about 31%, and again, that'll get smaller depending on the size of the institution in terms of the percentage. Federal, 14%, and institutional resources, about 27%. Auxiliaries, all the other things we talked about. Typical budget development calendar, I don't need to go through this, it's in here, but we start usually March, and in fact, we're looking at maybe even starting a little earlier as we go through that. When there's a legislative session, it's a little different because you have to adjust to that, and so you'll work through this, but then you'll have to make adjustments based on what the legislature did, and then obviously what the system approves. But ideally, we're trying to get a budget in place by September 1st for the start of the fiscal year. The LAR, which is again another term that your staff will talk a little bit about, is our opportunity in advance of the legislative process, or the legislature to sort of represent our needs. And again, it includes state funding only, so it's not the federal and the other pieces of that. And we'll talk a little bit about sort of formula funding, but more it's about things that we think are important in potential adjustments, kind of to your point of maybe ongoing changes to formula funding that may or may not be considered. But we'll also talk about some of those special item requests, they don't call special items, but new exceptions and the reasons for that. And so it gives us an opportunity to present those to the legislature in a number of hearings outside of in advance of the actual legislature meeting in January of the following year. And again, as noted, it's done in the summer previous, so it'll be done next summer prior to the next legislative session. Fiscal notes and analysis of bills, just so you know, I mean, your staff will spend a lot of time on this. This is, and part of it's defense and part of it's just helping everyone understand when the legislature proposes a bill, we want them, all of us to know what the implications of that will be, particularly from a financial standpoint. And so we do a lot of analysis, both in terms of other impacts, but particularly in terms of financial impact. If you do this, well, we need to add staff here. If you're raising scholarships, what's the impact, et cetera. And so we will do that, and again, note as well if there are financial benefits as well as cost. And then analysis of the appropriations funding, again, as that begins to work its way through, your staff will spend a lot of time looking at that, trying to understand the differences between the House and the Senate bill, trying to help, again, inform the legislature as to what the results of these particular activities may be. Recognizing still, you know, again, kind of like your jobs, another thankless job is probably being a legislator. I mean, it's just, there are limited resources and truly unlimited demands. Good things. I mean, these are all laudable and worthy endeavors. It's just trying to prioritize them and work them through in a way that makes the most sense. Then again, the typical development for a non-legislative year goes through there. External influences, Board of Regents, donors, legislature, parents, all of this has some impact. We talked a little bit about some of the perceptions of higher education that get played into that in terms of its lack of efficiency. I'll tell you, I worked in private industry before I came into higher ed, and just my, obviously bias, but personal observation, the people and staff in higher education work as hard or harder than anyone I saw on the private side. There really is a commitment to mission. It's a complex environment that they work through. Budget considerations, again, as you think about crafting your budgets, it's about all sources and seeing which you can switch one for the other. If there are restricted funds, but they can be used toward activities that you would use sort of some of your general appropriations for, you may free up general appropriations for other things. Prioritizing the expenditures, scrutinizing the budget for cost reduction opportunities. Obviously is needed, and we still, despite what I said before, we always and absolutely can be more efficient and effective in what we do. And then solutions for shortfalls and consider designated tuition increases. Long-range strategic, I don't have time, but this is just, again, our board introduced this, our chair, and when he testified in the legislature, talked about the need for more than just a single year's planning. It's hard to project out, and we do it to some extent, but we're trying to get a little bit more disciplined and rigorous in that as we work through to understand what the commitments will be, not just this year, but into the future. And so I'm not going to, again, these are some of we've built the annual budget, but we're looking at sort of 5 years and then resetting it each year so that we can anticipate what are the capital needs? What will we have to do? Do we have to raise more money going forward? What's the impact on tuition? Do we need to make adjustments if that's not practical? Again, we won't have it right, but as we adjust each year, it just gives us a longer-term financial plan looking forward. And again, I think that's leave that up. But I apologize. I probably ran longer than I wanted because I wanted to see if there were other questions. But I'm grateful. Again, let me end where I started and then see if there are questions. I really want you to know that your impact is significant. Any questions that I can?
I'm afraid we're out
Out of town, okay, sorry. Thanks.